we'll go ahead. As I mentioned, we are recording so that we can share this with a larger audience later. Thank you all for joining us, panelists. So good to meet you. Jen is my colleague, and our other two panelists are new colleagues in my space. So very happy to meet you, and thank you for those of you who have joined in to watch. I'd like to begin by offering a land acknowledgement. Here at Ontario Tech, we'd like to acknowledge the land on which we sit, which for thousands of years has been the traditional territory of the Mississauga-Scugog Island, which is a branch of the Greater Anishinaabe Nation, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. While we're grateful to be working on these lands, we're settlers and are by definition an uninvited presence, legitimated only through force and coercion applied by colonial forces of the past and present. Although we're all governed by William's treaties, we recognize the imbalance of power inherent in these treaties. Thus, we're committed to building partnerships that frame our presence by substantially changing the foundation of our relationship in accordance with the desires of First Nation people. So very pleased to be hosting this webinar here at the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism at Ontario Tech University. I'm embarrassed to say that I wasn't aware of Jen and Kate's book, Institutional Violence and Disability, Punishing Conditions, when it was published, but I did come across it just a few months ago and immediately thought, oh my gosh, we have to feature this in a webinar and really look much more closely at what initially was going to be interpersonal as well as institutional forms of violence perpetrated against people with disability. Now, I think our focus is going to be now primarily on institutional forms of violence. Our fourth speaker was unable to join us in the end, so Mark Brooks from the UK isn't able to be with us today. So that means the upside of that is that the three speakers who are with us have a little bit more time to devote so we can have a little more depth in the conversation. So I'm just going to provide quick bios for each of the speakers. Jen Rinaldi is an associate professor in legal studies at Ontario Tech University. Her research takes up how law reads, marks, and produces non-normative bodies. She's committed to supporting CRIPT, MAD, FAT, queer, and trans communities and embodiments. Her work documenting survivors' oral histories of the Huronia Regional Center, a Canadian institution that housed persons with intellectual disability diagnoses, resulted in a book co-authored with Kate Rossiter titled Institutional Violence and Disability, Punishing Conditions. She was also the founder and lead coordinator of the Huronia Survivors Speakers Bureau, which enabled institutional survivors to tell their stories to audiences across Canada. Currently, Jen is focused on research and activism related to deinstitutionalization and prison and police abolition. Our co-author, our second speaker, Kate Rossiter, is an associate professor who primarily teaches in the health studies program at the Brantford campus. She received her PhD from the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at U of T in 2009, and her MA in performance studies from New York University in 2002. Kate's work is highly interdisciplinary. She fuses a critical theoretical scholarship in health with arts-based practices, including theater and fiction. In particular, she's interested in critical theories of the body, disability studies, public health, and social determinants of health, and theater and performance studies. Tess Sheldon is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Windsor. Her research, including coercive medication practices in psychiatric settings, scrutinizes the role of law to protect and promote our community's health. She explores law's possibilities and perils to confront the institutions that reflect and reinforce disability injustice. She has practiced exclusively with Ontario's legal clinic system, including at Arch Disability Law Center and Justice for Children and Youth. So again, very happy to have you all with us. Very excited to hear what you have to share with us. So I'm going to turn it over. Jen and Kate are sort of doing a bit of a tag team here. So looking forward to the meshing. And I'm sorry, I think we're going to start with Kate, right? And Jen, you were going to follow? Yes, okay. And Kate, if you have a screen to share, you should be able to do that easily, okay?
Jen's actually going to do the screen sharing. She's the techier of the two.
Okay. Yep. Okay.
So she's going to manage the tech angle, and our talks are very much related. They both stem from the same larger body of work and the same sort of general data sets, and kind of, Jen and I kind of share not only a writing history, but a kind of writing and thinking brain at this stage of the game. So, the two really work in tandem. I'm going to be talking about the archival work that we've worked on in the last few years, and give a bit of a methodological overview of how we've done some of the work that Jen is also going to talk about. And the archive, and again, is available for viewing. It's a digital archive that we've worked on for several years, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the pieces of that archival work. So I will get started, and it is also my job to introduce, the Huronia itself. It's the site that we have worked on the most. So I'll begin with that piece. Located in Orillia, Ontario, the Orillia Asylum for Idiots and Imbeciles opened in 1876, a substantial growth period in Canada for state-run institutions for people with a range of disabilities, including blindness, deafness, and psychiatric diagnoses. The asylum provided a proving ground for new psychological diagnostic techniques that sought to identify and separate people with intellectual disabilities from other forms of psychological difference, for example, major mental health issues. Solidifying the role of state-run management for those necessarily forced outside the wage economy, the facility was administered by the provincial Ontario government and provided long-term custodial care for Ontario children and youth diagnosed as intellectual disability. And just as a kind of difference, a sort of flag of difference, asylums, places like Huronia were really were the provincial purview. They were not. It was not a church-run mission like residential schools. It really was a state provision of care. Orillia, a small town in southern Ontario, was a remote location for the asylum. Originally built as a large, imposing red brick Victorian manor, as many institutions of its type were, the institution was eventually divided into cottage wards. And cottage is a really nice sounding word for places that were, in fact, not whatsoever nice. The facility reached its capacity by its first year in operation and would proceed to spend its years expanding its acreage in a failed effort to keep pace with its population size. Its name changed several times over, reflecting new paradigms in institutional care, until it was last named the Huronia Regional Centre in 1974. By the time the facility closed in 2009, Huronia was the largest and longest standing institution in Canada to house persons with intellectual disability diagnoses. Huronia had been subject to several damning but ignored reports citing overcrowding, understaffing, and poor living conditions. Overcrowding meant the wards residents slept in were filled with beds arranged inches apart, making cottages noisy and unhygienic. In order to move from place to place, residents were forced to line up single file, spending a vast amount of their time waiting to do daily basic tasks, such as eating, brushing teeth, and showering. Often residents had to stand in those lines naked, waiting for communal showers. Food was monotonous and bland and made from cheap ingredients. These routines were enforced by ubiquitous forms of staff punishment, ranging from humiliation to solitary confinement to extreme forms of physical and sexual abuse. These conditions were well documented in watchdog investigations and provincially commissioned reports, all of which were ignored. In an effort to document the history of the Huronia Regional Centre, a group of 11 institutional survivors, 5 scholars, 4 students, and 7 artists formed the Recounting Huronia Collective in 2013. Our collective sought to story what life was like at Huronia and to better understand experiences of institutionalization. Our goal was to collect, preserve, and promulgate experiences that have too often been left out of public discourse. In 2014, the Recounting Huronia Collective received a Shirk Insight Development Grant to conduct a mixed methods, arts-informed project that has served as the foundation of our work ever since. It really has been the launching point for all the work that has come out of this group in the last 10 years. Jen and I published our book, Punishing Conditions. We also edited a special issue on institutional survivorship for the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. Our community outcomes included a cabaret performance at Buddies in Bad Times Theatre in Toronto and a speakers bureau, led by Jen, that enabled survivors to share experiences with key stakeholders in paid speaking engagements across Canada. Throughout, survivors were not just research participants, but invaluable members of the team. They've been credited as co-researchers in all of our academic projects. They've presented at conferences, co-authored publications, and have been named on grant applications. They've generated content, and we've sought their informed consent and detailed feedback across projects before putting anything tangible in the world. So again, over a period of several years, we amassed this really large amount of kind of, intellectual material, but really wanted some of those historical pieces to have a kind of both accessible and more permanent home. And so we turned to building this digital archive. Building the Recounting Huronia Community Archive emerged from our long-term project of generating and preserving survivor testimony about institutionalization. Rather than relying on legal testimony, for example, our project used multiple creative and qualitative modalities to support people who endured forced institutionalization to tell their stories. A large-scale open-access digital archive, now available for viewing and use, includes administrative files donated by survivors, letters, and digitized images of ephemera from the institution. We sought to frame the materials in such a way that the experience of violence and neglect were forefront, and second, that survivors themselves had a clear voice in the archive. These two aims dovetailed in regards to the presentation of official administrative files from the institution. These files were kept for every resident and were made available to survivors as part of the class action lawsuit that happened against the Ontario government in 2010. However, these files often presented survivor experiences of violence in ways that were coded, overly bureaucratic and medical, so much so that instances of harm were obscured or erased altogether. Because of this, simply including resident files without context did not feel like it aligned with our archive aims. Instead, the core of the archive centered on a series of video recorded interviews in which survivors described the content of their files, but more importantly, spoke about what was missing from these files, what the files got wrong, and how their experience differed from formal or administrative accounts of their lives. So for this talk, we want to focus specifically on work we've done with one particular survivor whose generational story of institutional harm stands out as particularly egregious and whose need for voice and restitution has been particularly stark. We are going to call this survivor by her own name in this presentation, with her consent. We've worked alongside Carrie for many years and have come to understand the importance of storytelling and public speaking to Carrie's sense of self and sense of healing from lifelong trauma. In our project, we work hard to honor survivors' wishes both for anonymity and for attaching their name to their own story, and sometimes that's a bit of a delicate balance. I should note here, though it's already been implied, that this presentation also touches on themes of physical, sexual, and emotional trauma, sometimes in detail. And again, sometimes, the kind of trying to find that balance between telling and reception is a tricky one. So Carrie Ann lived in Huronia from 1963 to 1971, from age 13 to 22. Her institutionalization was part of a longer family history of state-run care. Carrie's mother was institutionalized before her, and Carrie's children and grandchildren have been apprehended from their biological family and raised in foster and group homes. This history is deeply entwined with a brutal and multi-generational history of sexual abuse, both within the family unit and within the institutions charged with Carrie and her family's care. For Carrie, part of what this legacy means is not only that her own personal history has been rewritten through institutional files, but her family's entire history has also been reshaped by the language of bureaucracy and state-run care. This has been a particularly lasting and painful legacy of institutionalization for Carrie, who feels that her file is deeply flawed and in some instances written about someone else altogether. We want to illustrate the importance of rewriting historical and bureaucratic narratives by showing a few clips in Carrie's interview. First, Carrie began her interview for the archive by reiterating that her file was full of lies. So Jen's going to play a piece from that.
Checking, make sure, let me know if the sound doesn't work.
Carrie, I have 2 sets of files.
Yeah, it's all lies too. Most of it, if I went on lie detector, I'd pass. I would. The truth.
Oh, sorry. This clip is shorter than I'd remembered. Next, we want to show you a fairly lengthy passage from the interview. In this next passage, Carrie recounts the sexual abuse she experienced at Huronia in light of how her records document the institutional response. Staff screened for venereal disease, monitored residents' menstrual cycles, and recommended a sterilization procedure. Against this backdrop, Carrie remembers having children as a kind of defiance, a demonstration of agency, reaching for the life she wanted. This interview also provided Carrie the opportunity to provide context for her own decisions, which she made both to assert personhood and to reject institutional care measures. Within the official file, however, these acts were framed as delinquent and as signs of Carrie's further need for intervention and management by the institution.
I have this handwritten note. It's okay to read this?
Yeah,
Also
okay.
about pregnancy. So the staff says, at an opportune time, we went into the back room and in a low voice, she said, I have a baby in me. I asked, when did this happen? And she answered, when I was home with blank. And she asked how will you look after the baby? And you said, we're getting married at Easter.
Because I was confused. I didn't know what to do. Because the baby was inside me. Because when you miss your period, because they had staff kept track of your period in there. And they didn't, I would not give any monitoring to them. They refused. And I wasn't in love with this guy. I just wanted somebody to protect my baby.
That's why you had to leave.
Yeah, they didn't want to carry the information, the evidence, right? So I figured I'm going out. But the way he got me on the file, I'm like, I don't like these guys, all these different guys, to make them look bad on me, right?
Okay.
Because they're going to sterilize you, and they couldn't do it because I had a baby in me.
It says that the recent proposal of marriage has been canceled, but Carrie's insistent on keeping the child. Children's Aid Society has been informed. We will be able to assess the situation objectively and make suitable arrangements as necessary.
So they came to the house and asked me what I would do if my child was born. And I said, I'm not Kathy and I'm not my mother. I'm keeping it. And then the next day I took off with my son, with my baby after,
Why you wanted to keep the child?
because I love children. I wanted life. I want to prove to people I'm not my mother. I never had the chance to prove it. But they said I abused children. No, I wouldn't hurt children. Children and old people and pets for my life.
And just as a point of clarification, when Carrie's talking about Gravenhurst, that's another institution that she went to following Huronia. It's very common for people to have bounced around between multiple different institutions carrying legacies of trauma from place to place, and often that trauma was kind of redoubled at whatever institution they ended up next. So again, we can kind of hear Carrie's own insistence around making decisions and expressing forms of agency, expressing forms of personhood over and against the wishes of the institution. And we can start to hear how important those pieces were to her and how deeply not captured those pieces were by the institutional files, which simply wrote her in as someone who was delinquent, who was in need of further intervention, further care. To end, we'll let Carrie have the last word in this presentation on the importance of truth. Through this interview, Carrie tells truths that humanize institutional victims and survivors and give contours to their desires for a better life. And indeed, you know, some of the point of these interviews on the archive and to make space for these interviews on the archive was for just that reason, to allow survivors to humanize themselves, to humanize their own experience, to humanize one another, following a protracted period of really intense dehumanization. And so we really understood the kind of ethical mission of this archival work as one of providing a space for rehumanization. We could infer from her interview and myriad other contributions to the Recounting Huronia Community Archive that a history of Huronia that centers survivors contains lessons for broader communities in how to resist structural violence and honor marginalized populations. And indeed, I think they do. We also hope that the substantiation of testimony, its validation as public record, directly serves institutional survivors by enabling them to confront and process their forced institutionalization as trauma. So let's go back to how Carrie ends some of her interviews and thinks about her own project of rehumanization.
Guys,
I'm going back to the letter that your mother wrote. Your mother is saying that I'm feeling very upset about my son's death. I would like it if you could please send me the copies of from the time he was there. And then she also asked for a picture of her son. And
living with me when he died, when he committed suicide. Yeah, when he left the institution, he was still problems. He didn't want to go to prison, so he took his life.
like, this is your mother's records. You have yours.
Yeah, I do, in there. I wanted to put them all together, find out, you know.
How does
Yeah.
that help? Does it help you remember?
So I want to correct him for the mistakes they said wrong, that he could go at least peaceful, do not worry about problems. I know more about my brother than Aurelia or anybody else.
What do you remember about your brother? What was your brother like that you don't think is in miles like this?
He was a hippie. He smoked pot and weed and alcohol, and it was pretty high every time he came home. So I had fun with him all the time, like make him laugh.
Your family was affected by institutionalization. What does it feel like for this file not to contain all your truths?
Awful, horrifying nightmare. It's following my steps now till they took her children, and it's like I'm following the trauma where it all started from CAS.
Works its way through
You
your
can
family.
feel it right now, my trauma.
I can see the trauma. Yeah, this is a really hard history. So generally, Carrie, what do you think is missing in your file? What more would you want to say in response to these files?
I think that I would like the truth to come out. It's hurting because of lies. I'm willing to go on a lie detector, but that's true, not true. I want to prove my rights before I go on to this another world, you know?
So I'm going to end there and give Carrie that kind of last word. I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who's going to turn the focus a little bit away from some of the kind of more grounded pieces we've done with survivors around truth and testimony and holding on to history, and toward some of the newer work that we're doing that has to do with again, kind of theorizing violence a bit more broadly and trying to make connections between sites of institutional violence, taking what we know about the shape of institutional violence at places like Huronia and trying to expand out some of our understanding of what that looks like in other spaces, and particularly spaces that run currently. And Tessa is also involved in this work, so we're really happy that she's here today too. So I'm going to pause. I don't know if we're taking questions now, if we want to pause, how we want to do this.
I think we can wait to the end, and
Okay.
we'll sort of see how it comes together holistically. Maybe that'll pose different questions. Thank you.
And I will hand it over to Jen.
Over to me then. Thanks, Kate. So I think we've seen in Carrie's testimony that violence was an inescapable through line across the stories that survivors told us. And the instances that survivors described were brutal, but also pretty quotidian. They were deeply and inextricably embedded in Huronia's culture, and they were as ordinary as eating a meal or dressing for the day. In our book that we've been referencing today, we did theorize the institutional conditions that made possible and normalized Huronia's violence. But the history that we sought to make sense of felt larger than Huronia itself. We've been exploring how patterns of violence manifest in other sites of confinement in the Canadian context, and that can include residential schools, correctional facilities, psychiatric facilities, laundries for fallen women, group homes, and emergency shelters. Scholarly analysis of these social spaces reports, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse and active and passive forms of neglect and maltreatment. And that can happen across different kinds of facilities, different times in history, regional locations, government and staff turnovers, and even types of population. So while varied forms of institutional life bear striking resemblances, like use of isolation, physical restraint, compromised privacy, humiliation, and control of institutionalized populations, institutional violence has yet to be studied as this unique and predictable social phenomenon, reliant on underlying sets of assumptions regarding the need to at once care for and constrain particular subpopulations. We keep thinking that an approach is needed like this, that we need to really hone in on how to theorize institutional violence, because it's not just an aberration, it's not just the byproduct of a few bad staff or some poorly run facilities. It seems like violence is endemic to the logics of institutionalization, whether this happens within classical institutional spaces, like the regional center that Kate was just describing, or in kinds of spaces and practices that are common to contemporary landscapes of care and containment that have persisted since Huronia's closure in 2009. And we do think that understanding these patterns of institutional violence as a kind of social problem is not only important for advancing some kind of body of scholarly knowledge, but it's critical to supporting people who have had to endure institutional life and can provide evidentiary grounds to argue against present and future institutional projects. So understanding the organizational and environmental dynamics that have caused violence is imperative to preventing violence from reoccurring. Comprehensive historical and contemporary analysis of the structural conditions that cut across forms of institutional violence can inform opposition to institutionalization as a kind of social response to vulnerability. We can reimagine how we respond to disability-based vulnerabilities so that we're not reenacting institutional models. And we think that this is super urgent because totalizing institutional models break down, we see them close, but logics of institutionalization persist with us. They reproduce themselves in more insidious forms that still have the power to generate ableist violence. So we've been building a collection of works that look at different kinds of institutional projects that still reproduce the same logics we found at Huronia. And I do have the space here to maybe share some of the theorizations we've done around institutionalization as a kind of totalizing model, where violence is located, how we define violence, and what kinds of visceral responses to disability populations are engendering violence as response. So the term institution is found in sociological scholarship and can broadly refer to social organizations, this term we keep using. It can refer to law and government, religion, schools, and families, but these are types of institutions that are, objects of sociological study for sort of more generic things like their internal rules of functioning, their social roles and meanings that they ascribe to individual actors, and the ways they shape human behavior. A total institution, a kind of term that we keep using in our projects, is a kind of social phenomenon, a kind of institution that is much more closed off from wider social space. It's a term that comes out of Canadian sociologist Irving Goffman's work. He was credited with at least popularizing the term total institution, which he adapted from his professor Everett C. Hughes. Hughes was interested in studying concentration camps as an emblematic example of nucleated institutions. And I found that we can't really study violence without looking at scholars who've really explored violence in the context of the Holocaust. Goffman went on to study total institutions in the context of psychiatric asylums. And he defined total institutions as a place of residence and work where a large number of situated individuals cut off from the wider society for an appreciable length of time together lead an enclosed, formally administered round of life. He identified the handling of many human needs by the bureaucratic organization of whole blocks of people as the total institution's defining fact. Those needs can include sleep, food, health, hygiene, education, and play. There are many iterations of total institutions, including long-term care homes and orphanages, asylums and quarantine centers, prisons, and detention centers. For Goffman, total institutions share 4 features in common. We talk about how all aspects of life can be conducted in the same space of the total institution and under a kind of centralized singular authority. People who share similar defining characteristics carry out every part of their day all together on a kind of routine. All phases of the day then are activities that are tightly scheduled, and that schedule is imposed from above. And then fourth and finally, the institution has an official mission that the imposed activities are meant to fulfill, like rehabilitation, work, cure, or care. Goffman wrote about total institutions so he could call attention to their rather deplorable conditions. A key feature to the total institution then is this staff-inmate split, a kind of rigid binary arrangement between many residents and fewer staff tasked with supervision and care. According to the terms of this arrangement, staff only spend their workday in the institution and otherwise are integrated in the outside world. And the boundary line is so firm that there's very little social mobility between the two groupings. Social distance is wide between these two kinds of populations in the total institutional space. And communication tends to reflect a paternalistic power imbalance. Staff are vested with power and use that power to impose social control over their charges. Staff are vested with the power to use techniques that Goffman calls defacement and disfigurement. Defacement meaning you strip away from the institutionalized subject their usual appearance and the equipment and services that maintain it. So you have a uniform kind of clothing line, you have regimented toiletries that are shared or distributed by the institutional authority. And techniques of disfigurement involve mortification of the self by way of the body. So beatings and shock therapy become part of a closed social system. They become normalized such that they reflect the kind of legitimated objectives of the institution. So Goffman was writing about this long before we got here, and he catalyzed a movement that challenged the legitimacy of institutional authority across the 20th century North American and Western European context. In the years since he wrote, social arrangements have shifted, but rather than full dismantlement, these arrangements diffused in a process that has been called trans-institutionalization. That's an unwieldy and contested term, but it can characterize the numerous ways in which institutionalization and institutionalizing conditions are sustained. They end up hidden in plain sight, often under the guise of multiple connected social services that espouse to provide support, but which often reiterate older forms of violence. This arrangement extends beyond the management of disability and includes the organization of other populations that might be in need of more care than the usual subject. So following the deinstitutionalization movements that disability-based groups experienced and were at the forefront of in the 1960s, this whole-scale state-based warehousing of particular populations may have abated. It took a lot longer for intellectually disabled populations to see the closing of institutions. Huronia didn't close until 2009. But we can say now that a bunch of institutions have closed, so maybe we're in better standing. We might caution, as scholars of institutional violence, that we see a more fractured landscape of practices and management of populations deemed vulnerable or threatening to a larger social order. They still exist, they just exist in smaller formations and more fractured formations. That's been called a carceral matrix in some of our scholarship. That does date back to Michel Foucault's work on the carceral archipelago, which he doesn't theorize in great detail, but there's something evocative about the imagery of, you know, a scattered cluster of islands that connect beneath the water's surface. There's a kind of transmission of disciplinary mechanisms across our social spaces. So the total institution might have been compact and concentrated, but with the closing of these large-scale institutions that would hold thousands of people, their techniques ended up unspooling into community space. So while survivors have been able to put behind them their childhoods and adolescence of years spent at Huronia, some live in group homes now. Others are aging into long-term care. One survivor we work with has been to prison. So we owe it to the people we work with every effort to ensure they don't keep having to experience institutional violence. As long as there's time remaining, as long as we're defining our terms, we now have a fairly thorough accounting of institutionalization, and how we theorize violence then sort of fits into this puzzle too. And we've done some thinking around what violence looks like in its institutional form. So particularly striking political theories of violence have developed as a way of framing, again, I've said the Holocaust, an historical event that tied genocidal violence to spatial conditions of the concentration camp. Walter Benjamin, a Jewish intellectual who experienced imprisonment and exile under Nazi occupation, was forced into suicide when trying to escape. He penned a foundational critique of violence. He argued that violence of the human world functions as either a tool of governance, a means of making or preserving law, or the redemptive revolutionary acts that destroy law in order to create a better world. And then Hannah Arendt, herself a Jewish scholar subjected to imprisonment and exile during the Nazi era, developed this analysis, and she was careful to frame violence and power as distinct but connected things. She described violence as one way of directing the distribution and transference of power. Power is where people who already have easy access to it may use violence to reinforce their relationships, while people without power may use violence to claim, to disrupt their political relations. These theories posit that violence is relationally and politically grounded and could be coercive or liberatory depending on its direction. So we sort of imagined since then the development of theories of violence, especially under Johan Galtung, who's famously offered a more expansive reading of the relationships that manifest violence as a kind of structural thing. He defined violence as that which increases the distance between the potential and the actual. So violence does not necessarily factor into a dental emergency or a hepatitis diagnosis, but violence becomes an influential element in those examples when, say, survivors report from their experiences of Huronia that the afflicted person was subjected to physical beatings that affected their teeth, or sexual assault that came with transmitted viruses, or even more subtly, when they contracted infections, both dental and venereal, just from having to share toothbrushes and razors. So in these instances, something not natural, something human induced, got in the way of a person's potential to live their lives free of a medical condition, along with the attendant pain and discomfort that comes with it. We see a kind of human or structural condition that puts that reality out of reach. So the actors responsible for this violence are not easy to land on. They're certainly the staff members themselves, but also on-site management who do not enact proper safety protocols, even political actors at various levels of government across several election cycles responsible for Huronia's budget. where we land on who to blame might yield an analysis of violence that is itself structurally framed. It doesn't always explicitly tie to the personal subject-object relationship. Violence is structural when it is attributable to practices and policies that might shape daily living. We see that the interpersonal is embedded in political and economic systems of inequality that are associated with social relations. So this framing of violence accounts for, the press of settler colonialism and white supremacy and eugenics and cis heteropatriarchy, which can be incredibly violent systems in ways that extend beyond the interpersonal sphere. It's the kind of backdrop that informs our very much more personal relationships that engender violence. We've spent the last decade situating interpersonal violence in the context of these structural forces. But it has long felt like we were missing an emotional component to institutional violence. In our more recent work, a collection that we are developing, we started framing violence as affective, referring to affect as the forces that are beneath and alongside and generally other than conscious knowing that can serve to drive us toward movement, toward thought and extension that can likewise suspend us, to quote Segworth and Gregg. Affect is common work. It's coming up in our theory work these days, where it's a force that circulates and transmits between subjectivities. It's the thing that binds us together or mobilizes us to action or orients us in relation to one another. We try to imagine then violence in sort of Sarah Ahmed's framework of the affective economy, a marketplace where affect moves like currency that can be distributed and invested. The affective economy can operate and even flourish in a closed system like a total institutional setting, but can just as well expand across wider networks like the carceral archipelago that trans-institutionalization gives way to. So we have to see how affect moves along these relations, even as the relations stretch out into community and outside of the concentrated forces of the total institutional space. So we've been exploring what it means for violence to come about through affect, this kind of sticky phenomenon, that which sticks to us, that which leads to prejudice that ends up attaching to particular populations and individuals. I referenced Ahmed before. That is a theorist who's been exploring hatred and as an example of this kind of affective work. Hatred is this constellation of negative orientations that firm up subject categories, setting clear boundary lines that distinguish us from them. Rendering the them distinct from us, we see these ugly ideas that stick and cling to the object of hatred. They position populations in a relation of like againstness. Hatred carries a particularly egregious affective force given it mobilizes the hater in the direction of annihilating and exterminating the hated. We thought to posit that a particular subset of negative orientations, negative affects attached to disability populations, it's not always hatred. We don't see the full scale object of eliminating disabled subjects. We see something more like loathing. We see the way visceral reactions to disability look more like revulsion and disgust and resentment and disdain. So rather than eliminating the subject altogether, we see a kind of orientation toward disability populations that suspends the relationship, that leads to a kind of resented relation of care. So we've been wondering whether that kind of emotional response to disability, the way affect is produced along these relational lines, has a role to play in making sense of the way we structure institutional space as a kind of response to disability. and I've referenced care here, it's impossible to understand institutional violence without talking about care. Care is a different kind of binding agent. It's an entirely different set of orientations in the affective economy, given it orients us towards a kind of with a population as opposed to against it. It's found in feminist theorizing that care can carry a kind of affirmative effective charge. It connects people in relationships that can be really positive. The labor that care motivates can encompass decisions and practices that value the cared for. It can operate in ethically sound reactions to populations that experience vulnerabilities, which can be inevitable, can be tied to embodiment. We're all vulnerable, and there are people who are more vulnerable than others. So we have to imagine how to construct our worlds in order to respond to needs around care. But we find in disability theorizing that there's a lot of pushback against the coercive potential that can be folded into the DNA of care. The independent living movement catalyzed following deinstitutionalization, like this work in tandem for disability or disabled populations, trying to ensure that they can live in community and they have the supports they need, had a lot of critiques of care provisioning. They called out institutional practices of confinement and constraint and sanitation as violence under the guise of care. So an affective reading of care would hold it is not only a guise, not a smokescreen, but it's actually like the connective tissue between staff and residents that makes violence possible. We have to be really wary of care. Care grants access to bodies of vulnerable and vulnerabilized populations. It is what facilitates intimate and potentially invasive contact. So we're really interested in this push and pull dynamic where people end up working as staff or working as government officials who manage the responses we have to populations in need of more support, and how they have articulated services, how they've organized them around relations of care, but also without thinking about the ways in which affective experiences of loathing or that subset of hatred is baked into the care relation. And maybe I'll just end it there and give way to Tess, who's been doing some really great work around what disabled populations experience in a kind of version of institutional logic following the closing of large-scale institutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Good segue. Tess, over to you. She introduced you for me in that respect, so I appreciate it.
Amazing. Okay, thank you, Jen. Thank you, Kate. Thanks, Barbara. Can you see my screen? Yeah,
yes.
Perfect. Okay, super. I just want to say that I really loved, before I get started, I just love how the difference between the term vulnerable and vulnerabilized. I'm just grateful for that, Jen. You just said that, and I just noted it, and I think it's a good kind of segue into the work that I'm doing here. So the work that I am presenting today is about what the law says it does and what it actually does when it comes to gendered and disableist violence. So my work here has been to locate or try to locate the site or the geography of gendered disableist violence. And this struck me, and part of the reason I'm doing this work is because during Me Too, it was clear that the claims of some disabled survivors of sexual violence, those claims remain separate. And that shouldn't be surprising because women labeled with intellectual disabilities in particular have been excluded from reproductive justice spaces, what might have been called earlier reproductive rights spaces. So their voices, were not part of strategies to challenge gendered violence, but instead solutions were kind of crafted for them in the guise of care. And this all makes perfect sense because, feminist theories have not adequately explained the experience of disability violence. And that exclusion from reproductive justice spaces, from theorization, has a purpose. It's reflective. It reinforces structural biases that are built right in to the way people live their lives and how they live their lives. And I'm going to describe some of this in 3 different ways, maybe 4 if I'm lucky. So first, I'm going to talk about some contemporary correlates of that gendered disability violence that kind of sprouts from these institutions that warehouse people labeled with intellectual disability. So first, I want to talk about reports of gendered disableist violence. I want to talk about menstrual management and suppression. And I want to talk about parenting supports. Then I want to just shift a little bit into thinking about how the law has challenged or failed to challenge that gender disability violence, including through class actions and inquests and so on. But before I move in, just like quick content trigger warning. I'm going to be talking about violence and of the kind that really hurts people and even kills people. And I might say something that upsets you, and I'll try to warn you before that happens. So, like Jen and Kate have already said, disability has been dealt through systems and institutions of rehabilitation, compensation, and emulation of able-bodied norms. And when all that rehabilitation and emulation fails, there's a move to exclusion or elimination. And one of the most effective ways to exclude is to institutionalize. And so here, of course, this is an image of the Huronia Regional Center, where residents were subject to horrific abuse, neglect, gendered violence, and that violence became part of everyday life. And so folks in the audience might be familiar with the sterilization of Carrie Buck, Eve, and Leilani Muir. These are the 3 women labeled with intellectual disabilities, and they're coerced or non-consensual sterilization. It was actually produced by the place of the fact that they were in an institution, that violence was produced by their institutional placement. And this continues, of course. I'm noticing one of the comments in the chat is just about its persistence. And this image here is meant to reflect or, yeah, can folks see it okay, the image? Yeah, okay, thanks. Right, so this is intended to illustrate that idea that Jen mentioned of trans institutionalization, right? So the closure of some of these larger institutions in the 70s, and residents are discharged, but community-based services remained underfunded and oversubscribed. And despite the promise of deinstitutionalization, people labeled with intellectual disabilities continue to be detained in inappropriate and dangerous custodial institutional settings like group homes that are unsafe, especially during COVID, especially because they don't have adequate oversight. There's not enough data that comes from them. So the violence of those large institutions remain and cause harm. So, like, these community placements resemble, kind of look like present day versions of those institutions from earlier. They recreate a carceral setting. And we know that private for-profit group homes of today are particularly dangerous. Domiciliary hostels are particularly dangerous as well, because they're not subject to licensing frameworks or inspection requirements. There's also really troubling reports I wanted to talk about the host family program, where so these living arrangements, institutional living arrangements, produce a kind of gendered disability violence, where residents are vulnerabilized because of where they live. They might lack privacy, have fewer social networks. There might be a reluctance or a discomfort among workers to talk about sexuality. They may even be barred from sexual activity in the home, and remain isolated from those with whom they may develop an intimate relationship. And I've included here this image of T.L. Lewis, their work that on the relationship between racism and ableism. So here you'll see that their definition relies on this idea that ableism and racism are inextricably linked, that they inform each other, that they have the same root. And so some examples of white supremacist ableist practices would include things like anti-literacy laws that prevented Black people from accessing books, or things like distance from white supremacy. So drapetomania was a label that was a psychiatric label that was applied to enslaved people who tried to escape from enslavement. And then another example would be racist or ableist and ableist judgments about what kind of women are fit for motherhood and what kind of children should be born. So as I move through some of the examples and some of the legal responses, I think it's really important that we keep in mind that any response must also confront anti-Blackness and settler colonialism. I'm thinking about the surveillance through birth alerts of Indigenous mothers, the separation of children through, from migrant mothers, the targeting of Indigenous women in eugenical sterilization programs, like in Saskatchewan, where there's a class action about the coerced sterilization of Indigenous women right in hospital after birth. So this is first example. It's actually an image from NPR. They had a series about the experience of violence by women with disabilities, who are 2 times to 10 times more likely to experience violence. And women labeled with intellectual disabilities in particular are at a higher risk, including because of where they live, like group homes where sexual violence flourishes. There's an atmosphere of oppression. And there's no doubt that those stats are low because people labeled with intellectual disabilities will face barriers disclosing abusive experiences. They might also have been removed from sex education in school, right? So, if kids even get taught about sex ed, kids with disabilities, there are reports of them actually being removed from the classroom on that day. And that exclusion, literal exclusion from sex ed perpetuates rape culture. It can lead them to being targeted by other kinds of violence. And this may be particularly true for LGBTQ plus persons who may be presumed to be incapable of comprehending this kind of sexual education information, or of incapable of managing sexual relationships, all based on stereotypes about their capacity to consent. But without access to this information or education, they are more likely to experience sexual assaults, STIs, unwanted pregnancies. And it may also be that group home residents who do, ultimately are successful in reporting violence, they may be characterized as difficult or complainers or troublemakers and be subject to reprisal. Their family members may also be subject to reprisal if they try to support their family members who reside in a group home. And there are even reports of family members being trespassed from those group homes. And this, of course, all leads to discouraging the reporting of future offenses. So I've got an image here. You should be able to click on those live links at the bottom. If not, I'll make sure to post the links in the chat later. This is about actually menstruation. Menstruation in group homes has remained a key site of violence. And that's because menstruation is constructed as being distressing or frightening, because of sexist fears of women's blood, right? And so women labeled with intellectual disabilities who reside in group homes, they might need support to conceal their menstruation, right? But that actually often doesn't even happen. Instead of being support to manage their menstruation, they are instead offered options to suppress or even eliminate menstruation. And this should remind you of some of the earlier sterilization jurisprudence. And so the way that this is actually effected in group homes is through the use of oral contraception, which is used to suppress menstruation and could be replacing surgical interventions like sterilization. The other way that it's sometimes done is Depo-Provera as a way to manage menstruation. But like I said before, it becomes kind of a pretext for contraceptive sterilization. And there's rules from the Supreme Court of Canada, and this is the Re-Eve case, EVE, Eve. It sets limits on the non-therapeutic sterilization of people determined to be incapable. But there's been some shifting of what counts as a non-therapeutic sterilization. And so troubling kind of expansion of eugenical management of women's reproduction. And then finally, I think I have about 5 minutes left. Is that right, Barbara?
Yeah, thereabouts, 5 to 7. Take your time.
Excellent. And so the third site, so the first was reporting sexual violence, second was menstrual management or suppression, and third, parenting support. So group home residents who are mothers, they face restrictions on accessing parenting supports. And this, like all the others, including menstruation, restrictive practices in relationship to menstruation, it depends on this idea that women labeled with intellectual disabilities can't be sexual citizens and can't be good parents. And it also depends on this idea of mothering as a long-standing site of social control, particularly for women labeled with intellectual disabilities who face barriers meeting racist, classist, and ableist norms of good mothering. In Ontario, we know that about 1 in 20 women labeled with intellectual disabilities who have babies, those babies are directly discharged to Child Protective Services after birth. This is despite the fact that disability is a poor predictor of parenting skills. What actually is a good predictor of poor parenting skills is not having access to support, right? Not having access to parenting support programs. So there are some programs that are available to mothers labeled with intellectual disabilities. They're really limited, though. They are limited, for example, to in large urban centers. Parents with disabilities may also live in poverty and will have insufficient social support. So this kind of systemic factors, rather than the disability itself, that's going to impact their ability to cope with the demands of raising kids. And so here I've got an image from West Coast Leaf, an organization in BC that investigates the intersection of parenting, disability, and the law, and pays attention in particular to the closure of some of these parenting support programs. One in particular is like a parenting support program in jail. So really interesting and important work. So moving to the last-ish part of what I wanted to talk about today is like, what can the law do about this? Or what are the possibilities of law here? Or is the law like way too complicit in all of this? And I say that because, you know, law has paid attention in some ways to institutional violence. There's been some attention, you know, I'm thinking about the TRC, class actions about solitary. I'm thinking about class action about the treatment of Crown wards, national inquiry on murdered, missing, and Indigenous women and girls. So these are like, you know, there's some, I'm not sure what the right word is. There's some like appetite for legal redress to institutional violence. And when it comes to gender disability violence, one of the tools that we have in our toolbox is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And it has been said, the CRPD, to have marked a paradigm shift, thinking about disability as a matter of charity and social welfare, instead to thinking about disability as something about human rights, including a right to parenting support. Canada has ratified and signed it. It even signed its optional protocol. It includes tons in there, including a recognition that women and girls with disabilities are subject to multiple discrimination. That's really exciting because often like UN conventions don't do a good job of thinking about intersectionality, but at least it's written down here. That's at least something. There are a couple of provisions about a guarantee to persons with disabilities in the performance of parenting. So that's Article 23 up on the screen there. It's been said, though, that you know the CRPD requires more than just attention to like forced sterilization. It needs to pay attention to modern context or correlates of forced sterilization, including racist, ableist presumptions of capacity to parent. So class actions. So I think we've already kind of talked a little bit about the class actions around the closure, around Huronia, but like stepping back, a class action is a lawsuit where a large group of people come together to advance one large claim. It's supposed to be cost effective and efficient because it's like about one representative plaintiff who's bringing the action on behalf of all the class members. It spreads litigation costs around. But it's really worth being cautious about class actions. There's a lot of pressure to settle. And that's often because lawyers work on a contingency basis. And settling might appear to make financial sense. And there's a real pressure to settle. Claims processes are often inaccessible. There's questions about whether some of the residents of Huronia, their payments got downgraded when they couldn't participate in the claims process because they didn't speak verbally. And then another reason to be cautious about class actions is that they just take a really long time, and people die in the meantime. Another legal tool available, it's sort of an insufficient legal tool that is available to challenge disableist violence, gendered disableist violence that is lethal, is a coroner's inquest. So inquests into the death of people in a supported, in a group home under the Social Inclusion Act, defined by the Social Inclusion Act, is now mandatory. And so what I've got on the screen here is actually the report from an inquest into the death of Guy Mitchell. And Guy Mitchell had died in a host family program. So lived in the community and, not in an institution, but while he was living there, he did not have access to running water, no heat, no food, clear, violent living conditions. So one of the recommendations that flowed from this inquest was that there be a mandatory reporting obligation for all suspected cases of abuse and neglect, including in this community living type situation, the host family program. There is a inquest that is to proceed about the death of Samuel Brown, who died at a provincially run school for the blind in 2018. Another one problem with that is that everything's just so delayed that the inquest doesn't even have a date yet. And that Samuel Brown's death followed a class action lawsuit in Ontario. And that class action lawsuit about provincially run schools for the blind resulted in a settlement, but it didn't result in a way to protect Samuel Brown. He ended up dying after that settlement is made. And then the second to last kind of legal tool that we have, and I'll wrap up then, is criminal injuries compensation strategies. And I know I won't surprise you when I say that the criminal law is ill-suited to identify and respond to disableist gendered violence. Perpetrators are rarely held account, that women labeled with intellectual disabilities rarely obtain any kind of redress. They face additional violence. In Alberta, the criminal injuries compensation program was cut, recently terminated. There were also cuts to Ontario's Criminal Injuries Compensation Board. It ultimately got canceled in 2009. So even if these programs they're so deeply limited, it means that people who could have got some monetary compensation as survivors of violence now don't even have access to even that. And then I'll just leave this here. I'm going to leave it as an example of why things might actually be changing. So you've heard me say already that people labeled with intellectual disabilities are vulnerabilized to violence because of where they live, right? And that's despite the fact that safe housing is a fundamental and universal human right. And we know that from the CRPD. And so in Nova Scotia, there was a recent decision by the Court of Appeal there that relied on the CRPD to find that the province's failure to provide people labeled with intellectual disabilities with real choices, and instead they were warehousing people labeled with intellectual disabilities in psych settings, that was a breach of the human rights legislation, and even rely a little bit on the CRPD. I'm going to leave it there. I have one last thing I was going to say, though, is that it's currently today the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty today. And so this is a tweet from the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And it just reminds me that violence against women labeled with intellectual disabilities under the pretext of care is really just about containing and eliminating people who are assumed to be economically unproductive. And my dog wants me to stop. I'm sorry. I'm going to leave it there.
Thanks, Tess. You did well. You warned us at the beginning, and yet the dog was quiet until the very end. So brilliant. Well, I think that was just brilliant. And I mean, the intersections here between and across each of your talks, I think were just remarkable, and I think remind us of, and Jen in particular, your emphasis on trans institutionalization and what happens. We don't necessarily reduce the harm immediately by closing these total institutions. In fact, they may get shifted to community-based spaces, but other institutions as well, other total institutions, such as the prison, obviously, something that we didn't really get time to talk about today, but that's certainly one of the common themes, or an area of focus in criminology, is the extent to which the deinstitutionalization movement meant that in fact we end up criminalizing mental health issues, cognitive issues, a whole array of disabilities. So I thank you all so much for that. And you know what I'm going to do? We only have a couple of attendees, so I'm going to promote them both to panelists so we can actually have a conversation and they're not just sort of on the fringes. Did that move you or not? Yes, okay, there we go. Okay, so I'll open it up to our guests, whether you have any questions before we open it up to the panelists to sort of engage in conversation or questions there. So hi Laura, hi, thanks for joining us.
Hey,
Vicki,
no
let me
problem.
get you in. There we go. Vicki, you should pop up as a panelist in a moment. Okay, so go ahead, Laura. Did you have any questions of our speakers today?
Sure. Yeah, first, thank you all for your presentations. I thought it was great. I've worked in mental health settings and group care settings for a long time. I don't right now, but I definitely, agree with like the critique just of how institutionalized violence can exist. So yeah, I'm curious from your perspectives, and this is kind of for all of the panelists, I suppose, what vision do you have for non-oppressive support for folks with disabilities and folks who I guess traditionally have ended up in institutions and have ended up kind of locked into these kind of cycles of violence? Kind of what would be your ideal hope for reimagining care and reimagining, I guess, just like life in general for folks who have often been brought into these spaces?
I can start. Jen and I are actually just starting to think about this, so we don't have a great answer, I think, right now. One of the ways that we've thought this through in some of our earlier work are around actually like spaces that literally structure the care differently and like actually structure space differently, structure spatial relations very differently, structure the kind of meaning of humanity within those spaces and the kind of ultimate goal of those spaces. So, we find that in organizations where, humanity is deeply at the center of every part of the kind of organizational structure, that those feel very, very different. And where, I think this is a little bit speaking out loud, but when care, or like sort of thinking out loud, but when care is not tied to an agenda of containment or management, and where the kind of ultimate goal of care is understood as trying to uphold the humanity of people who are otherwise vulnerabilized or who are kind of outside of systems. I think those do very different kind of work. I think that spaces where care and loathing are twinned are ones where the efforts around care are tied to efforts around containment and management. And so I think that trying to undo that Gordian knot that Jen talked about, the kind of twinning of those two forces is maybe a kind of beginning place, although we're just starting to think that through a little bit.
Dovetail, which was great first thoughts. Kate, you're always good with first thoughts. We're going to be doing work in the coming months with Camp Hill Academy to explore how different organizations like Camp Hill or L'Arche have been trying to imagine what community-based care looks like for people who might require more assistance or support in order to live in community. And we've been trying to think through how to ensure that those kinds of supports and services don't become bureaucratized and don't become a kind of systems management approach that like gives way to institutional violence. So we're trying to sort of work with organizations that provide community living supports to imagine how they avoid the pitfalls to becoming a reproduction of the total institutional model. And then maybe I'll just note that like that means that it's a work in progress. And I can echo some of Tessa's notions around like how this work of deinstitutionalization has a lot to learn from like abolitionist movements that have been trying to contest and break down these systems of power that have enacted racial captivity across the years. And I think that a lot of the abolitionist scholars that have become prominent these days talk about how like it's always going to be a work in progress, but if we organize our communities around taking care of each other and keeping each other safe, then like that becoming our paramount principle might be a radical revisioning of care that doesn't get tangled up in the institutional histories that we've seen.
Tess, did you want to add anything? Yep, I see your mic came off, so go ahead.
I appreciate your question, Laura. My first response is like, please don't let law do that work. Please don't let law try to figure out the answer to that question. It is so not the right place to go for that. I've already given you some examples of like how law has super failed to do that so far, like class actions and inquests, totally imperfect, totally unsatisfying, more than just limited, like actually just broken. And part of that is because the way that we think about law and litigation is that we think about it like adversarially. And you can hear my dog, I'm so sorry, but the law conceives of litigation as being, one party versus another, and that presumes that violence is about one party versus another, that instead of thinking about its structural or institutional embeddedness, like law can't even understand that something bigger here. And in Australia, there's this the Royal Commission into Disability Violence, and ostensibly it's trying to like open up its scope to think about institutional and systemic violence against persons with disabilities. But even there, even unconstrained by traditional ideas of law and adversarial systems of law, it's getting criticized by disabled people's organizations for failing to, think broadly enough, right? Yeah, so I think it's really important to remain super skeptical and to ensure that law has no role in answering your really important question, Laura.
Can I double that? Like that, I'll echo Tess's point as the other legal scholar on the panel, just don't trust law. Tess did raise an issue that came up in our own research when we wrote a chapter on this in Punishing Conditions, on how the class action suit has abysmally failed survivors. Like they thought this was a way into, like they wanted to document their history on public record, and the courtroom was not really a space for that. And they wanted compensation that would enable them to like live in community and buy a house, and like the kind of compensation package that was on offer like won't change people's lives. And then the process for claiming funds became deeply entrenched in problems around who could access the most amount of money, whether they were able to advocate for themselves, whether they were still living and had communicative capacity, and whether they even had evidence of the physical and sexual abuse that would have been prioritized in the claims process. And we found that like instances of neglect and structural conditions of ableism, the kind of structural violence that we've referenced today, like didn't show up in a real material way as a reason for claiming funds. And then Tess will just note that like I'm starting to do work on coroner's reports myself, and they remind me of institutional records, because we find that coroners and health practitioners become implicated in law when they start diagnosing reasons for death in ways and reasons for harm and injury in ways that we've even seen in the institutional records, which is, not to blame law enforcement, not necessarily to blame staff of totalizing institutional spaces, and instead to sort of, Shireen Razak writes on this too, to reorient responsibility for death and injury onto the person who's experienced it. So our tools of redress need a ton of work if we're going to lean on them as the way into ensuring that disabled people experience anything other than violence and any sort of restoration from the violence they've experienced. Yeah,
and I'm not a legal scholar. That's Jen and Tess's, they're the smarts on that one. I agree. But just to note that, it's so frustrating to see this go on and on and on. Like, we are now in multiple rounds of class actions, institutional class actions in, and I just had a meeting a couple of days ago with somebody from community living here who's doing some claims on behalf of people who lived at CPRI. And they are, in fact, it's actually gotten worse, whereas I think that some of the claims people made for the Huronia suit, there's been like a kind of tightening of the belt, and the need for certain kinds of, hoop jumping, getting signatures from a doctor, a therapist, and, blah, 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 in order to verify the account of someone who lived there, because there's very, kind of the documentation in the files that people have since from CPRI is shady, or not shady, but coded and often thin on the ground, sometimes destroyed, perhaps a little bit more cautious than the some of the documentation that might have been produced for people at Huronia further, like, in the 1950s and 60s. So that, the kind of hoops that people now have to jump legally to get these, actually pittance of, not money that is going to be life-changing, and not money that's going to feel like it addresses the problem adequately at all. The staff members who have been charged with helping people make those claims are just tearing their hair out, because it feels, it feels like now the system is set up to deny those claims, which is an even worse outcome than, in some ways, no claim at all. I think, having to kind of go through that exercise in really humiliation, disbelief, second guessing, and then ultimately denying claims that are true, and we know that they're true. And Of course, there are other ways of doing things. You could call in scholars like Tess or Jen and I to say, yeah, what happened there is what happened there. We can verify, given our prior body of knowledge, that what this person says is true. Just give them the goddamn money. So I, you know, just to say that I agree with Tess and Jen, and that of course there are other ways of doing this. But law, as Tess I think is pointing out, is often really limited in how it works and produces uncare. Yeah.
And just I'll shut up, but like the reason that survivors pursued a class action suit, I think in part was because the burden of proof is lower in civil law than it would be for criminal prosecutions. We haven't seen a lot of staff members brought through the criminal justice system, and I wouldn't recommend it anyway, because I wouldn't want to put survivors through the intricacies and the conditions to testimony. Only recently have we seen intellectually disabled survivors of sexual violence can be credited as witnesses properly in trials. So we don't have the legal wherewithal to support survivors of sexual and physical abuse when their disability calls into question their credibility.
Yeah, their disability and their history, like it, you know, it's both. And you know, this kind of idea of having your day in court really sticks, I think, sticks for survivors. It's a kind of term that gets thrown around a lot, and I find it such a tender place, because in fact the amount of damage I think that could be done by having a day in court could be astonishing.
Yeah, I mean, it's really discouraging, because the solutions to date have really, you know, reproduced the harm in other forms, and are themselves forms of violence and marginalization. So, yeah, I appreciate you thinking forward in terms of what are some of the alternative structures and kinds of supports that we need. Any other issues that you wanted to raise amongst yourselves? I think this is a great opportunity for you to have this freewheeling conversation as you will.
Barbara, I just love what you just said there. Remember that the commission in Australia about the Royal Commission to Disability, one of the criticisms of it is that its failure to account for violence caused by the legal system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, well, we're at our time anyway, so I will we'll let you all loose now to go have your lunch. But really appreciate this opportunity to hear about your work and hear the voices of some of the people that you've spoken with, in particular Hionia. So thank you so much for that. And Tess, very good to meet you as well. I think these came together very nicely, and I really appreciate it. And don't apologize about your dog. I think we're quite used to screaming children and barking dogs and cats walking across computers, what do you call these? Keyboards. So yeah, happy to have those little peeks into our colleagues' lives. So again, thank you so much for this, and more importantly, thank you for the work that you do. I think it's so important, and really has the potential to change the lives of people who might otherwise continue to face these sorts of barriers, challenges, and in fact, disability violence. So thanks so much, and I hope to see you all again. Take care. Bye-bye.